Let us see how to play with the API. Now, if you don't know what is the API, you don't have to worry anything. You can just imagine API about the different ways in which we can play with the database. API is just a fancy word of specifying it. So what Django wants us to do is, it wants us to go inside the Django shell. Now this shell is nothing special, this is your regular Python shell, but since we are using a virtual environment, that's why we need to go inside the shell of our virtual environment. So let me copy this one first and let me open up my terminal. Again, let me clear up all of those things. Let me paste it right over here and let us go inside the shell. Now remember that I'm using IPython, and in case if you're not using IPython or you are using a regular Python shell, then nothing to worry. Just see that if we are going inside your shell or not. Again, we can clear up the shell by pressing Ctrl and L. Now let us go back to our documentation and let us see how we can start playing with our models. Now obviously the first thing, if we want to play with our models, then we need to import our models. So that's what they are doing on line number 1. Let me copy and let me paste. So let us import all of the models that we want. Let us go back. Now let us see how we can start playing with our databases. They are showing that how to query our database. So if we want to see all of the different questions that we have created, then we can use this API. So let me copy this one, let me come over here and let me paste it right over here. Questions.objects.all. So here we can see that we get an empty query set. So when I was first learning Django, all of these things sounded very confusing to me. What is this objects? What is this all? From where is objects coming? What do you mean by a query set? I had so many questions, and now it's time for me to make your life much simpler than mine. Let us go back to our code editor. Let me collapse all of these things. So inside our polls application, let us open up the module for models. So you can see that our class question is actually inheriting from another class called as model, and that's where this objects is coming from. So since we are inheriting from models.model, that's where we are getting this. Now objects is actually an instance of another class. Now you must be thinking, oh, all of these things sound very confusing, but right now just remember that just having a model will not suffice our requirements. We also know what to do with that model. So each and every model comes with an inbuilt model manager, but all of that complexity is hidden behind models.model. So from models.model we get a default model manager, and that default manager is simply called as objects. Now inside that model manager, which is actually a class, we have a method called as all. Now what this method is going to do is, it is simply going to query your database and it is going to give back all of the questions. Now if I have to say all of these things in a very simple term or in terms of SQL, let me show you what I mean. Now again, let me collapse this one, let me close this file, let me open up the SQL Explorer. Now let me open up my polls question, and this time I actually want to query my database. So let me right click and I can say that I want to have a new query. Now I don't need all of these things. Let me take it out. So here let us try and write a very simple SQL statement saying that I want to select star from my tables of my polls and question. Let me just right click and let me say, hey, I want to run this select that query, and here we get the answer, and the answer is blank because we don't have anything inside the table of polls question. Now if you want to translate this sentence from SQL to Django, then that's what we have done right over here. questions.objects.all. So this is what we call as the database API. We have to just write a simple Python statement, and that Python statement is then converted to a SQL statement which is run by Django in the background. So we just have to write a high level Python code, and that's it. So let us go back to the documentation and let us see. Now let us try to play a little bit more with our models. So the next thing is they are showing us how to actually create our model, or to be specific, how to insert some data inside our model. So here, as you can see, that they are trying to create an instance of question, but before that they are importing something. So let us copy, let us go back, and let me paste right over here. Let us go back. Now what's happening is they have imported this time zone, because remember, we have a field for publication date for our model of question. Now let me go back right over here. Let me close all of these things. It's not required. I don't want to save. Let me close this one. And inside our polls application, I simply want to open up the file of models. So here we can see that we have a field of publication date. And what is the type? The type is date time field. So we need some date time data that we can put inside this field, and that they are generating by using time zone. So again, let us go back. Let me just copy this one and let me paste, and then I can explain the rest. Let me paste it right over here. So what's happening right over here? This question is the model that we imported right over here. Now if we want to create question, we need to give input for two fields, rather three fields. The first field is for the ID, but as I mentioned, that field is being taken care by Django itself, and we don't need to specify the first field of ID. So what's rest? We have specified two different fields. So the first one is for the question text. What is the type of this one? The type is character type. That's why we are giving a string as the input for our question text. Now, which is the next field? The next field is for our publication date. Now, what is the type for the publication date? The type has to be date time. And that's what we are generating right over here. Now let us press enter, and that's it. We have created an instance of question. But what happens is we have just created that instance, but that instance is not copied inside our database. This brings me to a very important point, that all of the database operations inside Django are lazy. That means Django is not going to query your database till the time we require that data. So as we can see that we have just created an instance of our model of question, but we have not yet invoked a command for saving that database. That's why Django is not going to save it. We have just created an instance in the memory, and that's it. Let us go back to the documentation. So here we can see that in the next line they are saying that okay, now since we have created a question, now it's time for us to save it. So let us go back and let me paste it right over here. So here we are actually saving that question inside our database. So when we invoke this command, at that time actually the Django went and it executed an insert command for our database. Now we have a question, and that question has three fields. So let us check them out. So by default we have the field for the ID. Again, remember that this field is being taken care of and generated by Django itself. The second one was for the question text, and we get the answer as what's new. So that's what we specified right over here. The next one is for our publication date, and as you can see the format is in date time, and this is the answer for this one. Let me clear up all of those things and let us go back to our documentation. So we have seen up till here, and now let us see what we can do. So they are saying that if you want to change the values, so you can change that very easily. So let me just copy this and let us go back. Now remember, we have the question text as what's new, and we want to change from what's new to what's up. Now again, remember that the database operations are lazy. So since they are lazy, we need to tell Django to save to our database. Now the reason why they are lazy is we want to minimize our use of database, because if we just keep on constantly querying the database, that means our database is very busy. We have to use it only when it is required. So now when we say that, okay fine, let us save the data, only then that insert query or the update query ran in the background and the data was changed. We can verify by again saying that we want to see what's the question text, and we can see that the text has changed to what's up. Let us go back to our documentation. The next one is again, so this is our database API. So again, as I explained that if we want to see all of the questions that we have created, then we use this API. Now as we have a method of all, we have so many other methods as well for filter and get and so many other things. Now we get a response back. Earlier we saw that we had got a query set, but that query set was empty. But this time, since we have a question saved inside the database, we are getting some kind of a data. But as you can see, we can't make any sense out of this one. So let us see what the documentation is asking us to do next. So here they are specifying that we can actually create an dunder method for our models as well. So let me copy this one. Let me go back to my code editor, and for my model of questions, let me create this one, and let me copy this one for my choice, and I just have to rename for question text to choice text. Again, let me specify the type. So this one returns a string, and this one as well. So this one returns a string. Now let us go back and let us see what we want to do next. But before we can do this, let us go back to our terminal. Now remember, we changed the model, so we need to come out of our shell and go back one more time. Again, let me clear up. The first thing is we need to import from our polls question, and now we can again query the database. So we can say, hey, questions, objects and all, and here we can see that we have a query set, and the query set has only one object for question, and we can see that we get the string representation for WhatsApp. So now let us go back to the documentation and let us see what they want us to do next. So they want us to create a custom method called as was published recently for the model of questions. So let me first copy the imports. Let us go back right over here, and let me go to the top. Let us import all of those things, and let me copy this method. Let me copy, and then I will explain what's happening. So this is our class of question. Let me paste it right over here. Let me save the file. So what we have done is we have just created a regular method for the class of question. Now the return type is a boolean. I always like to add all of the type hints, so it's much easier for me to understand what's happening with my code. Now if you see what's happening inside this method is we just want to see that if the publication date is recent or not. And how do we know if the question is recent or not? So we say that if 1 day has passed after publishing that question, that means it is not recently published. So what we are doing is we are taking today's time or the time right now, and we are subtracting 1 day out of it. So if the question was less than 24 hours, that means the question was recently published. If it is more than 1 day or if it is more than 24 hours, then it is not a recently published question. And let us go back to the documentation. Now let us see what they want us to do. So these are a couple of more APIs or some more methods by which we can query our database. So let me get it right over here. So again, let me go back to my terminal. Since we changed the file, I need to come out of my shell, and again I need to go back again. Let me clear up all of these things and let us import question one more time. Let us go back. So again, they are showing how to query. This is what we did some time back. So let me copy and paste. So here we have one question inside our database. Let us go back. As I mentioned that we have different methods on objects. Now again, just to remind you, objects is a model manager. So when we say that we want to manage the model, that means we have different ways by which we can query our database. And here we specify that we would like to see all of the questions inside my table of questions. Now let's see what's happening over here. Now this time we want to be very specific. We just want the question where the ID is 1. Now if I have to write this in terms of SQL, then it would be something like this. Again, let me go back to my table and I want to have a new query. Let me collapse my sidebar. Now here I can say that I want to select star from my polls question, but where my ID is equal to 1. Let me run this statement and here we have the answer. So we get the exact query back. So we can see that the ID is 1, the text is WhatsApp, and this is the publication date. So this is what we are trying to do, but by using the high level API provided by Django. So let me copy this one, let me go back and let me paste right over here. So as we can see that we get the exact same answer back. Let us go back. On the next line right over here, we can see that they are showing a slightly advanced use of our database API. Now we have different fields for our question. One of the field is question text, and we want to query where the question text starts with what. So how do we do that? For that we use this method. So let me again copy this, let me paste right over here, and we can see that we have the exact same answer back because we have only one question and that question starts with what. Now one thing to note is we can see right over here that we have double underscore or dunders. So these are a slightly advanced use of the database APIs. So right now you don't have to understand all of those things in depth, but just get some small idea that we can do all of those things with our Django applications. The next one is again, they are showing that we can also query our database by using the time zone. So that's what they are doing. So I will not run this one, but let me try and explain what's happening. So first they are importing the time zone, and from the time zone they are extracting the current year. And now what we want to do is we want to query our question, but just for the current year. So again, you can see that we have a field for publication date, and then we have the double underscore. So we have the dunder method followed by year, and we are specifying that this year should be equal to the current year, and then we get the answer back. The next one is a very interesting one. So let me copy this one first and let me go back and let me paste it right over here. So we get an error back. Now what is this happening? So let us go back and let us see for the query. So this time we are using a different API or a different method called as get, and for the get we are specifying the ID as 2. Now remember that we have only one question inside our database and the ID of this question is 1, right? We don't have a question where we have an ID of 2. So that's what we are getting right over here. And if I scroll a little bit down, we get the answer as does not exist. Yes, obviously it does not exist because we don't have another question. So that's what this error is trying to tell us. Now let us go back. So here are a couple of more methods. So let me copy this one first and let me go back. Let me clear up all of those things. Let me paste it. So here what's happening is we are again using the get method, and this time we are using a different keyword called as pk. You must have seen that we have used ID before, but you can use PK instead of ID. Now PK stands for primary key. So this is a convenience feature provided by Django. And what we are doing is we are saving the output of this query to a variable called as Q. Now let us go back and let us see what they want us to do. Now remember, we have created a method called as was published recently. Now if you open up your code editor, let me close all of these things. I don't require this one, I don't require this one. So if you recollect, this is the method was published recently that we created, and that's what we want to query inside our database API. So let me again copy this one. Let me go back to my terminal and let us paste this one, and we get the answer as true. So yes, we just created that question a couple of moments back, and since it is less than 1 day, we get the answer as true. Now let us go back to the documentation. Now let us scroll a little bit down and let us see what's happening. So a lot of things are happening. Let us check them one by one. So here they are trying to show that if we have a question, then how do we query the choices from the question? Now let me clear up all of those things. Now we already have the question, right? Now let us see if we can query the choices from our question. Now remember, inside choice we have a foreign key for the question. So it's a many to one kind of a relationship. So we can have multiple choices, but all of those choices will point to a specific question which comes right over here from the foreign key reference. So if we have the question, then can we query all of the choices? Yes, we can. And we can query all of the choices by this one. Now just keep one thing in mind. Since we have a foreign key, that's why Django by default it's going to have this kind of a naming convention. Now choice is again the name of the model, and underscore set is the default way in which Django is going to query for your database. So this is just a Django specific thing. So let me copy all of these things. Now we have this question, and now we want to query for the different choices for this question. Now remember, we have not created choices for the question. That's why we get a blank query set back. Now let us go back to the documentation. The next they are showing that, okay, fine, we don't have any choices, but we can create these choices. So again, let us see how they are trying to create. We just saw that this is a Django specific thing by which it is going to query to our database. And this time we want to invoke a method of create. Now, since we want to insert something to a database, we want to use the method of create. And inside create, we have to specify the different fields for our choice database. Sorry, for the choice table. Now, if we check our model, so here we already have the question, but what we don't have is the choice text and the votes. So that's what they are specifying right over here. So this is for your choice text, and this is for the number of votes. So let me copy all of these things. Let me go right over here. Let us paste this one. So we have created a choice for this specific question. Now remember, the ID or the primary key for this question is 1, right? Let us go back. Now they want to create one more choice. Let me copy this one. Let us go back. They want to create one more, but this time they are assigning the value back to a variable called as C. So let me just copy all of those things. Let me run the query. So here what they have done is, as we can see that whenever we run this query, we get the choice back. And on this line number 12, they are just saving what we get back or the choice that we are getting back, and they are saving that choice inside a variable called as C, and that's about it. So now they are showing that since we have a choice, we can also access the question. Remember that the choice has a foreign key relationship with the question, so we can query the question from the choice. So let us go back right over here, and we can say that we want to see the question, and we get the answer back. What's up? So again, remember, this question is nothing magic. If we go back to our code, so this is the question, this is just a database field. So let us go back and let us see what's happening. So what they are trying to do next is, now we have a question, and from the question we can query all of the choices. Now remember, this choice underscore set is the Django's API, or the Django's way of querying your database, and all is the method that these guys are trying to invoke. So let me just copy this one, and let me go right over here. Let us paste this one. So here we can see that for this given question we have 3 choices, and that's what we are getting right over here. So let us go back, and here similarly as all, we can use a different method called as count. So let me copy this one and let me paste this one right over here. So here we can see that we get the exact count of 3 back, and that's what it is. We have 3 choices right over here. Now let us go back. Now here they are again trying to show a slightly advanced way of querying your database by the publication date and specifically the year. Now I'm not going to run this query. If you want, you can run this query, but make sure that you have the variable of current year inside your shell. And if you remember, we need to import some things like this one. So just remember to import your time zone and create the variable of current year before you can use this method right over here. Yes, before you can use this method. And again, this is also the same thing. They want to query the choice text where it starts with just hacking. So if you want, you can go ahead and you can invoke this API method as well. The last one is for the delete. So if we want to delete the choice, we can just copy this. Let me go back to this one, and if I want to delete this choice right over here for just hacking, so here I can just say choice.delete. Now remember, delete is just a method that we are trying to invoke. Let us go back. This brings us to the last part of the database API. The next part is for the Django admin, and I think we will start with the Django admin right in the next video.